503 conductor, you ready, George?
Ready, both sides are clear. Take them ahead when you're ready.
Here we go.
All aboard.
Why do we still love to climb aboard a train? What is it that makes us pause to listen to the cry of a faraway whistle? Those whistles still echo through America. You may think that today's railroads are mostly about freight or commuters, but there are still trains that people take just because they love this wonderful, unique way of getting there. The story of America's railroads is 150 years long, and its ties to our history are as strong as those that connect two rails together. It's a tale of romance and dreams made out of steel and velvet, good guys and outlaws, hard truth and the wildest fancy. And now it's time to board the trains to start that long journey down America's tracks. Our fantasies today are of planet hopping and powerful rockets into the unknown. But if you were a kid 100 years ago, that's the way you would have looked at the railroad, a route to the unknown.
Easy, boys, easy.
Mom, look! The railroad!
Oh, doggone little old hole. Oh, there.
Boy! Oh, boy!
Oh, there. Steady, boys, easy. Oh.
I'd like to be railroad.
What for? You gotta go just where those two little rails go. Suppose you want to go somewhere else.
I wouldn't care, as long as it was a railroad.
In the early years of this country, we all lived huddled in the East, and we all wondered what was out there in the vast darkness west of the Mississippi. Whatever it was could be conquered if the charge were led by great locomotives powered by steam. The America of the early 19th century was nothing like the America of today. It's not just that there were fewer people around and not a McDonald's or Taco Bell in sight. Before the railroad came, we were 100 different countries. Puritan Boston had little in common with Quaker Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania Dutch farmer and the Virginia gentleman farmer were as different as the Germany and England their people had come from. Americans in different places dressed differently and spoke differently. But we all had lust in our hearts to move, to build, to imagine a different future, and then make it happen. But in the America of the early 19th century, getting anywhere took real pioneer grit. Want to go from New York to Philadelphia today? You wouldn't think of flying. The cities are only 2 hours apart by car, less than that by train. But back in 1820, you thought twice before you'd try it at all. You'd figure a day minimum, and the trip was a nightmare of rotten dirt roads and stagecoaches that never heard of springs. You crossed the bay to New Jersey by boat before you even got to your first stagecoach. Then, 8 hours or so later, you had to switch back to another boat, and you'd sleep well that night. But hard as moving around was, we had no choice. This country was growing, and we had to transport goods inland from the port cities. Rivers seemed the easiest way to go, but rivers didn't go everywhere, so Americans simply decided to make their own. One of the greatest was the Erie Canal, which connected up the Great Lakes with the Hudson at Albany.
Terrible storm we had that night on the Erie Canal. Oh, the Erie.
It was 363 miles long, 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and cost $13 million old and very valuable dollars to open.
We were 2 days out from
It was a true wonder of the world when it was completed in 1825.
Foundered on a Chuckalakawanna coal. Oh, the Erie was rising, gin was a getting low. We scarcely think we'll get another drink till we get to Buffalo, till we get to Buffalo, yeah.
Of course, the speed of a mule-drawn canal boat was nothing much to talk about, really useful only for freight, and the whole thing froze over in winter. Nothing moved till May.
Ragged dress, and we hoisted her upon the pole as a signal of distress. Oh, the Erie was rising.
America wasn't going to go west at that rate. It was the English who put America on track. Coal mines in England had been hauling coal on tracks for years, but it was time to find something stronger than a big animal to pull the load. In 1801, a Cornwall man, Richard Trevithick, created a steam carriage that he intended to run on rails. By superheating water in a boiler, Trevithick managed to create enough steam power to propel this carriage. Unfortunately, it blew up. Fortunately, he was on a break at the time. By 1804, Trevithick had perfected a non-exploding locomotive, but that didn't prevent his dying so destitute that friends had to pay for his coffin. Another Englishman, George Stephenson, may be the true father of the railroad, because he was also the father of Robert Stephenson, and together the two showed the whole thing was not a crackpot idea. By 1825, the Stephensons had built the first railroad. It was the Stockton and Darlington, and its single engine, called Locomotion No. 1, pulled both passenger and coal cars. In 1829, the younger Stephenson's engine, Rocket, reached 29 miles an hour at England's Rainhill trials. Now, 29 miles an hour may not seem like that much, but it was whiz-bang in those days, and the Rocket laid the groundwork for later, much faster engines.
George Stephenson's locomotive, the Rocket, established the arrangement of the features of nearly every other steam locomotive. Had the firebox at the rear, the smokestack at the front, had a whistle, had a pressure gauge, had the locomotive engineer and the fireman at the rear of the locomotive and ahead of the tender, four-wheel fuel car tender behind with the water and fuel aboard. Nearly every other locomotive to follow, the next 125 years, is going to essentially be a duplicate of the physical arrangement of the Rocket.
And that's precisely why the idea of the Americans getting their hands on this stuff drove the English berserk.
The British regarded steam locomotives as a high-technology export product. They were unwilling to allow drawings or specifications to leave Great Britain. They would export whole locomotives. What that meant is that we began copying things very quickly in much the same way later on as other nations have copied our technology. The first British locomotives came over unassembled. That's simply how they had to be loaded on the ship. Our native American mechanics had to figure out almost from scratch how to assemble them and make them work. These early steam locomotives didn't come with manuals or a help hotline.
Then came along one of the great American men in railroad history. Colonel John Stevens was an engineer and highly respected veteran of the Revolution. In 1825, at the age of 76, he demonstrated the potential of steam engines on rails with a locomotive that he ran around a circular track on his estate in Hoboken, New Jersey. Kind of like the first model railroad, but full-sized. Which may be why a lot of people thought it was not much more than a toy. His son Robert knew better, and he'd organize one of America's first railroads 7 years later. The British understood that if you can't beat them, join them, particularly if they have a lot of Yankee bucks, so they began to sell steam locomotives and rail to their American cousins. One of the first was the Sturbridge Lion, which the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company brought over from England in 1829 to carry coal the mountainous 16 miles from Carbondale to Honesdale, Pennsylvania. It was described at the time as a mammoth grasshopper, but it was too heavy for the rails and wound up a stationary boiler beside the tracks. You can still see its rusted carcass at the Smithsonian, a hunk of metal you'd have hauled away if it ever showed up in your neighborhood. No, it was already clear that it was going to take a lot of American know-how to make the railroad work here. And with that know-how, Americans were building railroads everywhere to compete with the canals that linked the coastal port cities with the new communities to the west. In 1827, some public-spirited citizens chartered the Baltimore and Ohio, the first westward-bound railroad, which would run from Baltimore to the Ohio River in Virginia. The first section they built was just 13 miles long, but it was a hilly 13 miles, and a major feat, and a major risk for the city of Baltimore.
That city had tried to build a canal west to the Ohio Valley. It wasn't feasible. The next best thing in the mid-1820s was the idea of a railroad.
It is created at a time when America is still a young industrializing nation filled with optimism.
This was a gamble. No other long-distance railroads existed in this country, so the people of Baltimore were literally betting their future on this unproven but very practical technology.
Once the B&O had constructed its new rail line, all it had to do was to figure out what to run on it. One early carriage was powered by the wind, another by a horse. The wind-powered sail car had the unfortunate habit of going backwards, what with the unreliability of the wind and all. In the horse model, another bad idea, the hapless animal had to turn a treadmill, which then turned the wheels. But the demo collided with an undoubtedly startled and equally hapless cow. It took the great American mechanical engineer Peter Cooper to devise a steam engine for the B&O that could handle its rough terrain. But there was no way to get the iron pipes he needed for the boiler in the United States, so he devised them out of old musket barrels. Cooper created a steam locomotive in only 6 weeks. It was later called the Tom Thumb, after the famed circus star of the time. On August 28, 1830, Cooper pulled some very nervous passengers at 18 miles per hour on the B&O's new track. Some of the passengers made a point of writing down sentences during the trip to test the then popular belief that the human brain could not function when it was moving so fast. Legend has it that Peter Cooper tried to press his luck when he accepted a challenge to a race from stagecoachmen who saw the writing on the wall. 5,000 people gathered outside Baltimore to watch. The Tom Thumb easily outdistanced the stage, but then Cooper's engine threw a pulley and was stopped cold. The stagecoachmen won, but even they knew the point had been made. The future was in steam locomotion. At the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948, Disney animator and train buff Ward Kimball shot these home movies of a recreation of The Best Friend of Charleston. The Best Friend was built for the Charleston and Hamburg Railroad in South Carolina and was the first completely American-built steam engine to go into scheduled passenger service. Ward also took along one of his best friends for the trip, some guy named Walt. Sadly, the Best Friend of Charleston was the first American locomotive involved in a fatality, in this case due to a serious case of dumbness. 6 months into service, the Best Friend's fireman, the man who stokes the engine firebox, got a little sick of the noisy hiss from the steam safety valve, so he sat on it to shut it up. Sure enough, the hiss stopped, and all was quiet. Or at least until the boiler explosion blew him a lot further, faster than the old Best Friend could ever carry him. On the earliest steam trips, the passengers too were pretty entertained, but it was a long way from the in-flight movies of today. In August of 1831, the new DeWitt Clinton made its maiden voyage up in New York State between Albany and Schenectady. And as the burning cinders fell in a constant shower from the engine, the elegantly clothed guests were soon jumping up and down to brush out the flames on each other's elegant clothes. In fact, it was a while before the master mechanics who built the engines gave much thought to the people riding behind them.
Lots of early travelers talk about their trips as if they spent the whole time they were moving putting out each other's fires. People's clothes and hats and hair would catch fire from the sparks falling on them. The rails themselves were, initially at least, were just straps of iron that occasionally would come loose from their moorings and just sort of spring up and pop through the floors of the cars. And there's more than one instance on record of a passenger, sitting quietly in his seat, trying to shelter himself from the sparks, and all of a sudden being speared by one of these rails coming up through the porch. It was a risk to life and limb, literally.
Still, most everyone loved these new marvels, and women apparently were even more enthusiastic and less apprehensive than men about risking their life behind these early steam engines. They clamored for a chance to ride the rails. Just as history tells us, they were the first to ask for rides on hot air balloons back when they first appeared. And as steam engines began to prove their worth, towns, small and big, drew up plans for their own lines, and the money soon followed.
You know, along the east coast of the United States, all of the rail lines were built through private enterprise, sort of stock offerings. People that lived in New York had things that they wanted to sell to people that lived in Atlanta, for example. And people in Atlanta had things that they wanted to ship to New York. There was coal going one direction, there were goods going another direction. It was quite easy to see that there was a financial reward which could be gained by putting in these tracks.
One person who reaped such a financial reward was old Colonel John Stevens' son, Robert. When he offered subscriptions to his new Camden and Amboy Railroad in New Jersey, the entire stock of the railroad, $1 million worth, sold out in 10 minutes. In 1831, Stevens went off to England and shipped back the locomotive John Bull for his new railroad. But the John Bull was like a 10-ton jigsaw puzzle, arriving unassembled and without instructions. Eventually, a smart young machinist named Isaac Drips, who'd never even seen a locomotive before, figured it out and put it together using a whiskey cask as the water tank, sort of the very first bar car. Then Stevens had rails shipped over from England, but they were so heavy they sank a ship that was carrying them. Clearly, all systems were not in place yet.
The iron horse draweth nigh with his smoke nostrils high, eating fire while he grazes, drinking water while he blazes. Then the steam force is out, whistles loud, clear the route, for the iron horse is coming with a train in his wake.
The era of railroad building had arrived. And in the coming century and a quarter, one of the great names in locomotives would be that of the ex-jewelry manufacturer Matthias William Baldwin. In 1832, he built the 5.5-ton Old Ironsides, which moved, according to a local newspaper of the time, in beautiful style, working with great ease and uniformity. Soon, Baldwin got Old Ironsides to run a mile in an astounding 58 seconds. Just think of that. Most Americans of the time had never even seen anything move faster than a horse at full gallop, and that was only about 30 miles per hour, half the speed Old Ironsides was making. Eventually, Matthias Baldwin's company would become America's biggest manufacturer of locomotives, turning out more than 1,500 before he died in 1866. There's something else remarkable about Matthias Baldwin. As we'll see in the years after the Civil War, good citizenship was way down on the list of priorities for most of the men who built the railroads. But Baldwin was more than just a brilliant entrepreneur. He was also a staunch abolitionist who built a school for African-American children, worked for the improvement of the living conditions of workers, and became a generous patron of the arts. You've seen steam locomotives, the real thing, or pictures of them all your life. Here's a quick fix on how they work.
This is our number 18 steam engine, and it was built in 1910. It is a very simple design, very powerful design. We have a firebox that provides the heat. It merely boils water like you do in your house or in a pressure cooker. The water's taken to the highest part of the engine, turned into steam, moved forward, down through the front of these branch pipes, and that's what provides the power to this. So it's merely a steam-operated pressure cooker. The steam comes down this branch pipe. There's some valve gear here. That valve gear allows it to intake and exhaust steam into the cylinder. The cylinder merely pushes a push rod back and forth, which is hooked up to some counterweights in your axle, and that provides the force to move the engine.
But moving that engine through the countryside sometimes caused other problems, like, for example, relations with farmers. The farmer needed the railroad to bring him his materials and ship out his produce, but the railroad needed the farmer's land for its tracks even more, and the railroad agents were the kind of city slickers who'd promise anything. That's why in 1843, one stubborn gentleman of the land, Adrian Holbert, faced off against an oncoming locomotive. "This railroad," he shouted to the startled engineer of an Erie locomotive, "can't run no cars through my farm until the company settles with me." The Erie did, of course, and by 1851, it became America's longest railroad by pushing past high mountains, deep forests, and more perverse farmers to its terminal at Lake Erie. The train was turning up all over the place now, and as it did, it was creating all kinds of new problems and then new solutions. Cows. That was a big problem at first, as a 1,200-pound Holstein would amble across the track just as the 515 was coming through. No wonder that angry bulls would run at the defenseless engines and knock them off the track. It was Isaac Dripps, the smart young man who'd figured out the John Bull, who came up with the cow catcher. Actually, the first ones were really cow nailers, just two big spikes sticking out from the engine that impaled the poor unsuspecting bovines before they knew what hit them. It took a block and tackle to pull off the first one, which led real fast to the hit 'em and scatter 'em type we know today. And some Michigan farmers complained to the Michigan Central about all the livestock they were losing to the new speeding locomotives. Fair enough, the Michigan Central agreed. "We'll reimburse you for your losses." And with an eye towards the goodwill of the Michigan voter, they did, at a rate 3 to 4 times the market value of the animals. Well, an amazing thing happened. The number of livestock killed went up. Of course, that could have been because a lot of farmers started feeding their cattle right alongside the main line, and it said right between the rails for the older and sicker animals. Did you ever wonder why hard steel locomotive wheels on hard steel rails don't just slip? Well, they do when they're pulling a heavy enough load. So something was needed to help the wheels hug the rails. It was sand that worked, spread from pipes in front of the engine's driving wheels. And ever since then, the sandbox has become standard on American locomotives. And what about traveling at night when you couldn't see the cows in front of your face? At first, they tried setting wood ablaze in an empty car attached to the front of the train. But even after they came up with kerosene headlamps, the locomotive could still scare the bejesus out of people. Just imagine what people who saw the belching, deafening, and spark-throwing engine coming at them in the night must have thought. As Henry David Thoreau put it, "When I hear the iron horse make the hills echo with his snort like thunder, shaking the earth with his feet and breathing fire and smoke from his nostrils, it seems as if the earth had sent a race now worthy to inhabit it." But not all of Earth's inhabitants had such glowing reviews of America's trains.
The European visitors to America were appalled by the American railroads. They considered the Americans to be rude in the first place, trains to be unseemly democratic in their configuration. We must remember, in America, we gave birth to the corridor or aisle day coach with an open corridor down the middle with rows of seats on either side. unlike the European compartment cars, where you were safely contained with people of your same class and did not have to mingle with the riffraff.
Englishman Charles Dickens, for example, expressed his horror at our railroads in his book, American Notes. And the English were appalled by the engineering of our railroads. They considered them shoddily built at best, potential disasters at worst. They were particularly aghast at the explosive boiler pressure Americans used to get their engines over the high mountains. Well, la-di-da, we did take chances, no question. There were a lot of needless deaths. But American railroading was advancing the art in ways the English never even thought of because we had to. We had a huge nation to settle, and we didn't have the time to refine the railroad before we did it. That settling often involved fancy financial footwork. In the 1840s, the Erie Railroad tried to buy Seneca Indian land in upstate New York for virtually nothing. The Seneca chief responded with a counteroffer of $10,000. But the land isn't even good enough to grow corn or potatoes and has no good timber, the Erie complained. The chief shrewdly replied, "It seems good enough for a railroad," and the tribe got its fee. In fact, nothing could stop the railroad in its early days, and nothing seemed to stop passengers from using it either, even though the service was unreliable at best and the frequent derailments required the passengers' help to resit the cars on the tracks. There were no bathrooms or drinking water. Instead, the poor riders suffered tobacco-stained wooden seats and cars that were boiling in summer and freezing in winter, except near the open pot-bellied stoves that threatened to incinerate everyone in an accident. And accidents there were, by the carload lot. The carnage on the tracks was something staggering. There were 900 accidents between 1853 and 1859 alone, and they killed over 1,000 unlucky passengers. And the accidents would inspire reams of songs and poetry, always heartfelt, often dumb. You've heard them: the wreck of Old 97, Old 56, Old 24. Lyrics like, "He tried to beat the 507. He's at the throttle now in heaven."
And when we reach the White Oak Mountain, you can watch old 97 roll. They were going down the grade, making 90 miles an hour when the whistle broke into a scream. He was found in the wreck with his hand on the throttle, scalded to death by the steam.
Besides the primitive technology, there were many cases of drunkenness, carelessness, and just plain stupidity on the part of the engineers. Each accident quickly became a legend. 46 people died when a New Haven train fell through an open drawbridge at Norwalk.
Come on, you ladies, you better take a warning from this time on.
Another 49 were victims of a bridge too poorly built to hold the train. In 1853, the Michigan Central and the Michigan Southern each claimed the right-of-way at the same crossing near Chicago. No surprise, 18 people died one day when the two arrived there at the same time. At the end of 1830, there were just 40 miles of track in all of America. But by 1860, there were more than 30,000 miles of track. Everywhere was quickly becoming connected to everywhere else. In a booming American economy, farms and factories could be anywhere. And what they grew or made could be sold all over America and to the world beyond. And as the railroad brought prosperity, it turned jerkwater towns into small cities and small cities into hubs. By the way, jerkwater was a railroad term for towns so small the water pipe had to be jerked to refill the engine. The railroad also turned small military outposts into cities. Chicago started that way.
Chicago as a city began almost at the same time as the railroad in the U.S. In the early 1830s, what is now Chicago, the site of Fort Dearborn, was just a series of mud flats. The place name, Chicago, roughly translated from Indian, meaning the place of the stinking onion. Right from the beginning, the Chicagoans realized that railroads would make their city. It was going to become our grand central junction, the new city of the heartland. And indeed, by the 1850s, when railroads began reaching Chicago, its future as a major transportation nexus was assured.
All aboard for Atlanta, Birmingham, New Orleans, and Chicago on track number 7.
One after another, new railroads connected Chicago to points east and west. By the time poor Mrs. O'Leary's cow was charged with knocking over a lantern and setting the city ablaze in 1871, Chicago was on its way to becoming the hub of America's railroads. By the 1850s, railroad lines had sprouted everywhere east of the Mississippi. What with trunk lines and branch lines, the whole eastern United States was like a giant forest of railroads. But more than half the country still lay untouched by a train, and the next great barrier was the Mississippi itself. And by the time the railroads reached the mighty river, it was already a bustling highway of water traffic. It was also, incidentally, the stuff of fantasy for young men. Mark Twain told us, "When I was a boy, there was one permanent ambition among our comrades in my village, and that was to be a steamboat man." The legendary Mississippi steamboats plied their trade up and down the river, carrying goods, good people, and rascals, scalawags, knaves, and rapscallions as well. More to the point, steamboats were carrying goods and people across the river as well, and their owners weren't falling all over themselves trying to get the railroads to share in the profits. And the mighty river seemed to protect them.
For those people who were worried about the expansion of the railroad or who operated competing modes of transportation, like the riverboat operators, the Mississippi was seen as the great barrier, the thing that would keep the railroad from expanding to the west, that would preserve the competitive edge that the river travel had at that time.
But you can't stop progress, and on April 22, 1856, thousands of spectators watched as a Rock Island locomotive pulled the first train across a brand new bridge spanning the great river. A new service was born, and all was well for a while.
Well, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. The Rock Island Line is a road to ride. The Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. If you wanna ride, you gotta ride it like you find it. Get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. ABC double XYZ.
Then, just 2 weeks after the bridge opened, a curious thing happened. The steamer Effie Afton crashed headlong into the railroad bridge, and both boat and bridge caught fire. The bridge was destroyed. What a bad break. The steamboat owners quelled their sorrow long enough to hang up banners that shouted, "Mississippi Bridge destroyed. Let all rejoice." Then they sued the railroad for damages, claiming the ruined bridge was now a hazard to navigation. It would take a smart lawyer to go up against the entrenched steamboat interests, but the railroad men were lucky enough to find the best. He studied the river every which way, its currents, its depths, and then he made the startling assertion that the accident was no accident at all. It was sabotage. And his well-spoken admonition, rivers were to be crossed, and it was the manifest destiny of the people to move westward, might give a hint to who he was. This smart young lawyer was named Abraham Lincoln, and he'd be president of the whole United States before 4 more years had passed. By 1860, almost all of the locomotives in America were being produced in the northern states. The North also benefited from more than 20,000 miles of railroad track that tied these states physically, economically, and politically to the Union. The southern states, on the other hand, had less than 10,000 miles of track. This difference would play a key part in the war that would soon divide the nation. The importance the railroad would play in the Civil War was announced rather prophetically on October 17, 1859, when John Brown and 18 fanatical followers seized the railroad bridge across the Potomac River and stopped an eastbound train at Harper's Ferry. Throughout the remainder of the war, this strategic bridge would be built and rebuilt 9 times. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, America's railroads faced their first big test. Both sides had a powerful new instrument of battle, one that could move troops in large numbers in good weather and bad and supply them far from home.
At first, the generals and politicians really didn't know what the railroad could do for them or against them. Very quickly, as the war began heating up in 1861 and 1862, the officers in the field especially realized that with the railroad, they could make their army mobile.
Not so long after the rail lines had gone in, wrecking them became a major military objective. To keep the rails from being reused, troops would twist them around tree trunks to become what the Union men called Sherman's neckties. Troops in major areas of struggle like Northern Virginia would arrive by rail and leave by rail, destroying the tracks behind them. So the construction, destruction, and rebuilding of rail lines and rolling stock never stopped. In one of the war's many turning points, the Union moved 25,000 men on 30 trains to bolster their forces in Tennessee in under 12 days. No one could question anymore that this was a true railroad war. It was Atlanta's position as a railroad hub that made it William Tecumseh Sherman's prime target in his bloody march to the sea. The reputation of men was made on their ability to get the railroads up and running as fast as possible. One of the best was the Union bridge builder Herman Haupt. He constructed a 400-foot-long, 100-foot-high bridge over the Potomac in under 2 weeks. A dazzled President Lincoln reported, "I have seen the most remarkable structure that human eyes ever rested upon. Upon my word, there is nothing in it but beam poles and corn stalks."
The American Civil War, in many respects, was won by the industrial capacity of the North, and an important component of that industrial capacity was the ability of the North to build, maintain, repair, and efficiently operate railroads on behalf of its war aims.
I believe that the North won the war, not only on the basis of its superior manpower and its industrial capability, but because the North really knew how to use railroads to get the men where they were needed.
But the most celebrated railroad story of the Civil War was the great locomotive chase. A Union spy named James J. Andrews took a band of volunteers deep into the South to capture a train. The goal was to move it up the line to an imminent battle site in Chattanooga, Tennessee, destroying the rail line as they went to prevent Southern supplies from reaching Chattanooga. As portrayed in this famous Buster Keaton movie, Andrews and his men on April 12, 1862, boarded a Western and Atlantic Railroad train and its locomotive, the General, while the train sat unguarded at Big Shanty, Georgia. They headed north at full steam. But soon, a conductor for the railroad named W.A. Fuller and a shop foreman named Anthony Murphy, 2 of the South's most remarkably plucky men, gave chase, not on a locomotive, but on foot. Soon they switched to a handcar, the only rail vehicle available, but that wasn't much of an improvement. Fortunately for them, rail traffic kept slowing the General up ahead. Before the chase was done, Fuller and Murphy switched to a succession of locomotives, and for hours the General barely kept ahead of its pursuers. Andrews and his men threw whatever obstacles in their path they could. They tore up rail, obstructed the tracks, even tried to set a bridge on fire. But Fuller and Murphy just kept coming. Their last engine, the Texas, reached speeds of 60 miles per hour on the rickety, poorly maintained tracks. Finally, out of fuel, the General ground to a stop. And what the movie didn't show was that Andrews and his men took off for the woods in hopes of crossing the Union lines to safety. But most never made it, and Andrews and some of his men were tried as spies and hanged. The war ended in 1865, but the railroad still had one more sad duty to perform. Anybody who lived through the 1960s remembers the funeral of John F. Kennedy. Television brought us all the moving procession in Washington with the unforgettable image of the riderless horse. From the moment of his assassination until his burial in Arlington Cemetery, America slowed to a mournful pace, and no one did not think of the slain president at least a few times on each of those days. Well, that was the mood 100 years earlier, as the assassinated President Lincoln made a long final journey home. For a week, the flag-draped funeral train wound slowly, mournfully from Washington through big cities and small towns back to Springfield, Illinois. At the cities, the body lay in state, and everywhere the tracks were lined with somber, tearful men and women united in grief. Cannons and church bells rang out all along the route. By 1865, the railroad was an accepted fact of American life, the fast and efficient way to travel, and a key part of any war effort. But for anyone who saw it, that wheeled cortege must have changed forever their image of the train. It was a fitting end to the first great period of railroading in America. Almost overnight, a new period of railroad adventures was about to begin. It would be even more raucous than the first, and it would bring with it a totally new America no one could possibly have imagined.
This train is bound for glory, this train. This train is bound for glory, this train. This train is bound for glory, don't care nothing but the righteous and holy. This train is.
When Abraham Lincoln went home to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois in 1865, it was a railroad train that took him there. And in that picture was the history of America till that time. By the mid-19th century, thanks to the train, all the lands to the Mississippi were well settled and well served. Then the Civil War left the nation bitterly torn apart, and the train had been a key part of that terrible conflict. Now the railroad was about to come into its greatest glory. It would get Americans back to the job of expansion until a continent-wide nation was ours. After the war, we began to think of ourselves as a nation, a United States. Instead of Virginians, Georgians, Carolinians, or Connecticut Yankees, we started calling ourselves Americans. Americans have always loved slogans, and our drive west was driven by a great one: Manifest Destiny. A New York publisher coined that in 1845, and it seemed right enough. One nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific was the Almighty's plan. But this immense continent was worth almost nothing unless we could get to all of it. And thank God, the railroads were there to make it happen. Back in Europe, the railroads connected up the great cities built long ago. Here, The great cities were still to come, and it was the railroad that was going to build them. And there was a very big reason to reach the West, and that was gold. The 1848 discovery at Sutter's Mill started the California gold rush, and who knew what other fabulous wealth lay out there. But without a railroad, getting there was not half the fun. You could go overland by stagecoach from Missouri, but there were no roads, just Indian paths and ruts where settlers ventured before you. That was a brutal 17-day journey over 1,800 savage miles, opposed by mountain, burning desert, and Indians. Or you could go by sea. If you've seen those ads for luxury cruises to the sunny Caribbean, forget it. This wasn't even a little bit like that.
If you lived in, let's say, New England and wanted to go to California, you had 3 ways to do it. The simplest, not the most direct, but perhaps the easiest, was to get aboard a sailing ship for the long journey around South America. 17,000-mile voyage around Cape Horn might take 3 to 5 months depending on the season and the sorts of weather conditions you encountered.
Or to travel overland on a stagecoach that would place you in peril of being rattled and jounced to death and attacked by savage Indians.
They could follow the east coast of the U.S. down to the Isthmus of Panama, cross over, braving the malarial rainforests, and then sail up from the Pacific.
Risking contracting yellow fever or malaria if you were bitten by the wrong mosquito, and there you could catch a steamboat to San Francisco.
One traveler described this journey. Our party was half dead from fatigue, draggled with mud and shivering in torn clothes that for nearly 60 hours had been drenched with rain. The other male passengers, all who had been in good health, made themselves comfortable. In less than 10 days, all were dead of yellow fever but one. I alone of all those afflicted survived. In the 19th century, a steam engine could go faster than anything else made by man. It's no surprise that the call started to be heard for a railroad clear across the country. Out west in California, an engineer and railroad advocate, or you could say fanatic, named Theodore Judah tried to convince the assemblyman in Sacramento to start building a railroad east. His annoying persistence won him the fond nickname Crazy Judah. But then progress isn't made by retiring types.
Theodore Judah was a gifted, brilliant, egocentric, and absolutely humorless civil engineer. He became convinced it was possible to build a railroad across the continent to fulfill the dream of manifest destiny. He conducted surveys of the central Sierra Nevada mountain range and believed that there was a way to get from the Sacramento River Valley over the summit of the Sierra Nevada just 100 miles away.
And at this Sacramento hardware store, Judah convinced 4 local businessmen, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Leland Stanford, and Charles Crocker, that the dream of a transcontinental railroad could be a reality. These men, later known as the Big Four, did not embrace Judah's idea just for the good of the country. It's often the promise of big money that makes men public-spirited, and the discovery of the Comstock lode of gold and silver in Nevada suddenly made a railroad a very good idea.
These fellows were not visionaries. They were hard-headed, cold-eyed, fairly ethical businessmen who saw that with government aid, that it really was possible to build a transcontinental railroad. They were also astute enough to know that they could make a great deal of money if this thing worked.
But they would need the government's help. On July 1st, 1862, even as the Civil War was raging, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. This authorized the Central Pacific to build a rail line east from Sacramento to join the Union Pacific, which would build west from Omaha.
What the act did was to give to the railroads outright a strip of right-of-way along which they would build the rail line. They were also granted fairly significant amounts of land on either side of that railroad right-of-way. And then finally, the government would loan to the railroads $16,000 for each mile of track laid on flat ground, and a much larger amount for each mile of track laid in the mountains.
That meant that in today's dollars, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads were getting nearly $500,000 per mile on the plains, nearly $1 million on the plateaus, and $1.5 million over the mountains. It's no wonder the railroad men took on this monumental task with such enthusiasm. But the financial dealings involved in getting the two railroads started were very complicated, and their backers were interested in keeping them that way. A hint of the goings-on can be glimpsed in a ruling inserted in the act by Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. Though the Civil War made American iron harder to get and British iron was cheaper, Stevens patriotically insisted that this be an all-American project using only American iron. Luckily, Stevens himself was an iron manufacturer. In Sacramento in 1863, the Big Four's Central Pacific Railroad broke ground and began its path east. Theodore Judah, who may have been crazy but not stupid, soon realized his partners were far more interested in lining their pockets than building a railroad. When he protested, they bought him out. So Judah left for New York to find the money to buy them out. But on the trip east, a mosquito proved Crazy Judah was right to fight for a transcontinental railroad in the first place. It bit him as he crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and he was dead of yellow fever soon after.
I think in the annals of American engineering history, there is little, if anything, to compare with the accomplishment of those men who built the Central Pacific through the Sierra.
The Central Pacific certainly faced a formidable task. Between the starting point in Sacramento and the flatlands of the western desert were, of course, the towering Sierra Nevada mountains. In the long history of mankind, nothing even remotely like this had ever been attempted. With the still rudimentary tools of the time, through bitter winter snows, the Big Four were proposing to cross 7,000-foot mountains.
They had to blast tunnels through some of the hardest granite anywhere in the United States, if not in the world. Granite so hard that they were using hundreds of kegs of blasting powder a day. And even with that kind of explosive power behind them, there were days when they were able only to push into that granite, to chip into that granite a few inches. And they didn't have to do that just once. They had to do that in tunnel after tunnel, over mountain after mountain.
Across the continent, the Union Pacific would certainly have an easier time of it, at least until they reached the Rockies. The plains were good and flat, but they were also nearly treeless, and the railroad would need untold amounts of wood for construction to reach its target. But the first target for both railroads was hiring labor, and lots of it. It would take armies bigger than many around the world to supply and build this colossus. At first, the Central Pacific tried American labor, but many of these men they hired felt they'd like to get rich too, and left as soon as they reached the new gold and silver mines of Nevada. So Charles Crocker tried something unprecedented. He turned to the Chinese.
Some 16,000 Chinese lived in California in 1864. Most had been drawn to California by the lure of the gold rush, as had been people from every other country around the world. Charles Crocker, the construction boss of the Central Pacific Railroad, suggested that the Chinese be tried as a railroad construction crew. This idea was treated derisively, and there was tremendous prejudice against the Chinese at this time. But he said that if they could build the Great Wall of China, they're certainly capable of building our railroad.
Crocker's pets, other workers would call them, and they suffered appalling prejudice. But on they went about their work, chipping away by inches at the granite rock, hanging from baskets over deep ravines as they inserted dynamite into the rock, surviving untold hardship in the hope of one day returning home. But words and old pictures still cannot capture the sheer enormity of building across the Sierras. Avalanches were a continual deadly threat. Blizzards were an everyday occurrence. The snows here are what had forced the legendary Donner Party to cannibalize each other for food 20 years before. To protect trains from the killing snows, the men of the Central Pacific constructed nearly 40 miles of snow sheds over the new track lines. 8,000 Chinese worked around the clock for months to bore their way by hand the quarter-mile through the summit tunnel. Some days, the progress was measured in inches. At last, in the summer of 1868, the mountains had been conquered, and only the flatlands lay ahead. With few interruptions, the rate of track laying accelerated, and the all-out race with the Union Pacific began. We've seen how the Big Four got the Central Pacific started in order to enrich themselves in the process. Well, they were like children compared to what the owners of the Union Pacific were up to. Principal among them was Thomas Durant, an ex-doctor from New England who had been instrumental in getting the 1862 Pacific Railroad Act passed. Getting the Union Pacific started was a tough job at first because the whole enterprise seemed mad. But he lent enough money to friends so that the railroad could be incorporated with himself in firm control. Durant admired, in the way any ordinary fish might admire the piranha, the French banking group Crédit Mobilier, which had made its backers obscenely wealthy as it built France's public monuments under Napoleon III. Durant set up his own Crédit Mobilier in the United States for his great railroad. He used this front to charge the government grossly inflated prices for the Union Pacific's construction costs. He would then siphon off the difference between the real and the exaggerated prices and divvy up the profit between himself, his friends, and helpful congressmen. Almost immediately, the Crédit Mobilier was thriving, while the Union Pacific was going steadily bankrupt. Clever as the scheme was, its excesses would eventually bring about Thomas Durant's downfall. The Union Pacific held its groundbreaking ceremonies on December 2, 1863. In the manner of those days, the hyperbole ran thick. Here's what Durant's associate, the enthusiastic and aptly named eccentric George Francis Train, had to say. The Pacific Railroad is the nation, and the nation is the Pacific Railway. This is the grandest enterprise under God. But progress was slow for such a grand enterprise, and Durant clearly needed someone to take control of construction. In 1866, he hired Grenville Mellon Dodge, an ex-Civil War general who organized his men like an army, 10,000 strong. As his construction bosses, Dodge chose two brothers, Jack and Daniel Casement, and they in turn hired a crew of Union and Confederate war veterans, former slaves, and immigrant Germans and Swedes. But the bulk of the UP crews were Irish, recruited straight from Ireland by the boatload. Under the Casement brothers, the perfect organization of the work was a pleasure to behold. It was like an assembly line, with the surveyors up ahead, the graders behind them leveling the ground and building the bridges, and then the trackmen themselves laying the ties, then the rails, spiking them down, then adding ballast to keep them in place. All followed by the supply trains right behind them. The rhythms of the work were so constant that songs that followed those rhythms became another tool of the job. There was Whoops Along, Louisa Jane, Brennan on the Moor, and the most famous, Drill Ye Tarriers Drill.
Drill ye tarriers drill, drill ye tarriers drill, or you'll work all day for the sugar in your tank.
Of course, the world didn't stop while the Transcontinental Railroad was being built. In 1868 in France, for example, Claude Monet painted Saint Adresse. Up in New England, Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women. In Russia, Tchaikovsky composed his first symphony. And at Badminton Hall, the Duke of Beaufort's home in England, the new game of badminton was devised. Badminton, a lovely game. Out on the plains, the men who were building the railroad might have tried it if they weren't too busy drinking and gambling and whoring and shooting each other dead.
These men had a fair amount of disposable income and nowhere to spend it. And America being America, we were very quick to provide entertainment. They were called Hell on Wheels.
The verdict read murder in the first degree. Lee Brown hollered, Lord, Lord, have mercy on me. He looked at the judge.
As the railroad moved west, towns along the route were thrown up overnight, witness to unimaginable debauchery for a month or so, and then more or less simply abandoned.
The end of track in the Union Pacific Railroad was followed by a sort of portable city, an ad hoc Sodom and Gomorrah known as a hell on wheels, in every sort of vicious pursuit which a young man needed on the great prairie and frontier was available there. Gambling dens, halls of negotiable affection, saloons, and any other vice you needed could be provided for on the Great Plains.
The sweet little town of Benton, Wyoming boasted 23 saloons and 5 dance halls. It wasn't the Chamber of Commerce that described its good people as a congregation of scum and wickedness, almost everybody dirty, many filthy, and with the marks of lowest vice averaging a murder a day, gambling and drinking, hurdy-gurdy dancing, and the vilest of sexual commerce, the chief business and pastime of the hours. This was Benton. As many men as lost their lives building the railroad, probably 4 times as many were murdered in the Hell on Wheels towns. And then even the towns got out of town. When it was time to move on, buildings would be knocked down and taken by rail to the next site.
These were very transient towns, though. Some existed for a week or 2 and then moved on and didn't leave a trace, except the legend of Hell on Wheels.
One day a train arrived in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the next town up the line from Julesburg, Colorado, with all of Julesburg's gamblers and dance hall girls and half its knocked-down buildings aboard. Gentlemen, a brakeman is claimed to have said as he started tossing off his wooden and human cargo, here's Julesburg. Things got so bad, what with so many needed railroad men making one-way visits to town, the Jack Casement was called upon to start cleaning things up. And with the help of some vigilantes, the worst of the offenders were suddenly absent. In Laramie City, Wyoming, 4 outlaws were hung from telegraph poles. When one newspaperman questioned the hangings, he was told they apparently all tried to climb the poles and broke their necks in the effort. And what of the people who lived smack in the path of the oncoming rail line? The Plains Indians certainly had claim to the land that was being bisected, what with the deeds they'd received in perpetuity from Washington. This had been their land, and it was still sacred to them. But America didn't become America by holding back when there was progress to be made. So if the railroads and their friends in Congress had to move these people out of the way, so be it. And that's how small skirmishes soon became all-out war between the tribes and the United States Army. It's hard to believe there was anyone, native or white, who didn't know how it would end. But for a while, these Native Americans certainly slowed the railroad down. The Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, as they were called, would attack the lead men, the railroad surveyors and track layers. In 1867, the U.S. government sent Generals Winfield Scott Hancock and the flamboyant George Custer to solve the problem. They leveled native villages all over the plains and killed hundreds of their people. And in the end, of course, the trains went through.
There were no great Indian massacres. The legend of the building of the Union Pacific Railroad is quite colorful, and the relationship between the railroad and the Indian tribes has been embellished beyond almost all recognition. But there were a few celebrated incidents where groups of Indians derailed trains or interfered with track construction crews. And these incidents, while tragic, did not constitute great massacres, but they were characterized by the Eastern press as tremendous affronts to American pride. And this brought about the customary American sorts of retaliation. The Army was brought in to protect the railroad construction crews, and the United States Army and their Indian Guide clients set about a program which would ultimately culminate in the near extermination of the horse tribes of the Upper Great Plains.
On the Union Pacific, there was a notable native attack at Plum Creek, Nebraska. The Cheyenne had lost everything to the Army and decided to derail a locomotive in retaliation. An English telegraph repairman, William Thompson, was shot and then scalped. He survived by playing dead until he could crawl away. In his dazed state, he retrieved his scalp where the Indians had dropped it and carried it in the hot sun 15 miles to the nearest station. After attempts to reattach the scalp failed, Thompson gave it to the city of Omaha, which displayed it for years at the public library. As for Thompson himself, he returned, very understandably, to his native England. The original transcontinental plan had the Central Pacific and Union Pacific meeting somewhere east of the California line. But when both railroads reached Utah, they didn't stop. With so much money paid for each mile of track laid, they simply passed each other by and kept on grading. At some points, the two parallel lines were within 150 feet of each other.
No formal decision had been made about where they would meet. And since the railroads got money according to the amount of track they laid, it was in the interest of both railroads to build as much track as possible, so they weren't in any hurry to meet. And finally, President Grant said, you know, this is madness, this has to stop. So he told both of the railroads, you have to get together and fix on a point at which you're going to meet. So they did. Representatives of the railroads got together and they decided upon Promontory Point.
Then, at last, on the morning of Monday, May 10th, the joining of the two railroads was celebrated. The Central Pacific's Jupiter locomotive and the Union Pacific's number 119 faced each other across a final rail's length of track. Gold and silver spikes had been brought to the site to commemorate the event. There were the usual prayers and speeches for an occasion like this, duly recorded by photographers and newspapermen. Then the Central Pacific's Leland Stanford, by now Governor of California, raised his silver-plated hammer high to drive in the last spike. He swung and missed, which set off howls of laughter from the trackmen who'd just driven 1,000 such spikes. Thomas Durand of the Union Pacific, whose skill at building railroads had never been remotely physical, then took his turn, and he too missed his mark. Some would later say that was just good manners. Finally, at 12:47 p.m., the spike was driven home, and the telegraph message went out to the nation. Done. What had once seemed an insane dream was now in place. After 6 furious years of construction, America had a spinal cord of steel that united its two great oceans. Almost instantly, the whole nation erupted in celebration, the way they would 100 years later when Americans would land on the moon. This was the moon landing of the 19th century.
Jesse James was a man, a friend to the poor. He'd never see a man suffer pain. And with his brother Frank, he robbed the Chicago Bank and stopped that Glendale train.
It's amazing how many colorful characters the railroads inserted into American history. While the robber barons were picking the railroad companies clean from within, a small and plucky group of ruffians were trying to do the same thing from without, on a much smaller scale, of course. This new brand of bandit saw the trains as rolling safe deposit boxes and easy pickings.
It was relatively easy to stop a train. In the era when communities were widely scattered in the West, you could pick an isolated spot, disable a train, incapacitate the crew, steal the strong box or blow open the baggage car and be off with the loot in no time at all. People who aspired to become wealthy the easy way by taking it from others knew this. They knew that the railroad train was an easy mark, and there were two kinds of train robbers. There were those who would hold up the passengers of a train and collect their valuables, watches, jewelry, and money, and those who would look for, if you will, the high-value cargoes, payroll, government currency, bullion, being shipped in a baggage car.
And by the 1870s and 80s, there were enough people sick of the railroad's high-handed ways to make many of the train robbers popular heroes. It was just like the gangsters of the Roaring '20s 50 years later. If the bad guys weren't exactly giving to the poor, at least they were robbing from the rich. And when America began making movies, the great train robbery showed there was no better subject than robbing the rails. At the end of the film, actor George Barnes points his gun towards the viewer, which is said to have made a few hearts stop in the audience. It's worth noting that the robber barons may have been lonely, selfish individuals, but train robbing seems to have been far more a family affair, what with the Renos, the Daltons, Youngers, and the Jameses. Other colorful characters included the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, Kid Curry Logan, Butch Cassidy, and of course, Harry Sundance Kid Longbaugh. And if you're a fan of the hard-boiled detective novel, you also owe a debt to the railroads because they gave us private eyes. A Scotsman named Alan Pinkerton and his sons William and Robert were hired by the railroads to track down and remove the train robbers. Pinkerton men were never the most popular guys in town. They were sometimes pretty brutal in their work, but they were very good at it. And the Pinkertons' National Detective Agency soon had operatives all over the country. Because there were always new robbers to replace the old, Pinkerton was on the job for 50 years. It never did get the James Gang, though, even after 10 years of trying. By the way, it was the Pinkerton motto, "The eye that never sleeps," that gave us the term private eye. The West wasn't the only place that was wild in the late 1900s. In the East, a group of scoundrels was bent on making a pile of dough by buying and selling established railroads. The most famous battle was between the tyrannical Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt and his bitter rivals, the Erie Gang, Jim Fisk, Jay Gould, and Daniel Drew. And if ever a bunch of guys deserved each other, these were they. When Vanderbilt decided he had to have the Erie in 1868, he started to corner the Erie stock by buying up all he could find. But it was the damnedest thing. The more he bought, the more there seemed to be available. What he didn't know until too late was that the Erie Gang had gone into the printing business, turning out unending supplies of increasingly worthless Erie stock. Finally, the Commodore offered a truce.
The Vanderbilts on the one side and the Erie Ring on the other fought a pitched battle on Wall Street that ruined many, many people. They profited handsomely, but in the end, Vanderbilt had to admit defeat and took a financial bath and went on to fight other fights.
After that fight, the Erie gang could continue to control the railroad. Of course, that poor thing had been nearly forgotten in the financial war, and it had been rendered so worthless that few people wanted to even ride on it, much less own it. Still, the boys continued to spend their railroad's money as if it were the Bank of England. They purchased an opera house in New York for their offices and charged the Erie $75,000 a year for the rent. Then, with all the loyalty of sewer rats, they turned on each other. Fisk and Gould ousted Drew. He would later die penniless. And by the time Fisk and Gould left, they'd put the Erie into debt so deep that there came to be a famous phrase to describe it. Icicles would freeze in hell before Erie declares a dividend. And in fact, it was nearly 75 years before the Erie was solvent again. And as the Iron Horse was changing America, it was changing itself as well. Time was when traveling by train was little better than traveling the old stagecoaches. The cars were filthy, the ride bouncy and hard. But God bless America, if you can pay for it, they will build it. And by mid-century, class had come to the rails. And the name of the man who brought it would become synonymous with luxury travel for a century. George Mortimer Pullman brought fine carved woods, engraved mirrors, polished brass, deep carpets, electric lighting, and embroidered upholstery to his cars, and America swallowed it up. Beside the parlor cars for day travel, there were the sleeping cars that made Pullman's name. They had comfortable beds that folded away during the day. There were cars with magnificent private rooms, and others with upper and lower berths from end to end. The name Pullman became synonymous with luxury travel. The tiny onboard kitchens of today's trains were originated in the 1880s by Pullman. He pioneered dining cars that served ornate meals of game, roasted joints of meats, and elegant desserts. Before dining cars, eating on the transcontinental rail trips had been a dismal business.
Passengers were entirely at the mercy of the railroad when it came to meals. The train would stop at an eating place, and the passengers would be herded off of the train in a crowd, forced to eat whatever food was available, given a very limited amount of time to bolt down that food, and then herded back onto the train so that it could take off. So the entrepreneurs, the local operators of these eating establishments, were free to do just about whatever they wanted to.
The operators of these things would exploit the passengers horribly. They charge $1 or $2 or $3 for a sandwich which might be made with moldy bread and inedible meat, realizing that once they got back on the train, and they'd have to hurry back on the train to catch it before it departed. They'd open their sandwich, and no matter what it was, they'd have to eat it. There'd be no recourse. There'd be no going back.
An Englishman, Fred Harvey, changed all that. His restaurant in Topeka, Kansas was such a success that the Santa Fe Railroad hired him to open places all along its route. The food he served was tasty and wholesome, but it was the wholesomeness of the Harvey girls that marked the biggest change.
These were waitresses in Fred Harvey restaurants who were well brought up, well-mannered young women who wore immaculate starched uniforms. Many of them were recruited from the East and came from at least some semblance of a cultured background. They were expected to maintain the highest moral standards. They were taught to be efficient waitresses, but at the same time pleasant and courteous to their customers. These women brought at least a semblance of cultured civilization to the frontier. Fred Harvey ended the days when a cowboy would come into an eating establishment and prop his spurs up on the table and drop off his gun belt on the floor.
Trouble was, the men out west had never seen anything like these Harvey girls, and they were drawn to them like bears to honey. Old Fred was losing so many of them, he finally made them sign a contract forfeiting half their salary if they went off and tied the knot their first year. The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th marked the start of the third and last great period in the history of American railroading. By the turn of the century, the frontier that the railroads helped open up was relegated to the dime novel. Just about every place was settled and peaceful, and the days had passed when the railroads could do anything they wanted. And the men behind them who'd sell their grandmothers for a half a buck, they were gone too. All in all, progress had neatly cut all the color out of the story of the railroads. There had been just too many people out there who demanded that the railroad barons be tamed. It was like a giant and ferocious dog brought to heel. And then something amazing happened. The railroads noticed they could profit by appealing to the passenger. The golden age of American railroads had begun. Trains had been around since the 1840s, but even all that hullabaloo about the Transcontinental Railroad didn't change a basic fact. Until the 1890s, traveling by train wasn't all that swell. Most trains were uncomfortable, bumpy, sometimes downright dangerous. Service wasn't anything you'd write home about, and with the state of the mails at the time, the letter might not have gotten there anyway. But the most annoying part of train travel was how long it took. You think of trains with names like the Flying Zephyr? It was really more like the Sleepy Snail. Then, in the 1890s, the railroad started to get serious about speed, made possible by better tracks and more powerful engines. The little train that could now grew bigger and bigger until it was a behemoth. Some of these massive engines reached remarkable speeds. In 1893, the Empire State Express reached 112 miles per hour between New York and Buffalo. In your lifetime, you've never traveled to New York or Buffalo at anywhere near that speed, and you probably never will. Of course, more speed brought more danger, sometimes with a direct effect on popular culture. Engineer John Luther Jones, better known as Casey Jones, was taking the Illinois Central Cannonball out of Memphis for Canton, Tennessee. He was 95 minutes behind schedule, a disgrace for an engineer in those days, so he tried to make up the time by running at full throttle. He almost made it, and then a brakeman with a lantern in hand warned Casey to slow down, but it was too late. And as generations of railroad fans know, he smashed full speed into railroad history.
Casey Jones, he mounted to his cabin, took a farewell trip into the promised land.
What happened shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't happen in this day and age, but that's what happened back then. Casey Jones messed up. He wasn't a good engineer. It's a song, and it happened.
In the popular legend, he's a hero. Among railroad people, Casey Jones is just a sloppy runner, a poor railroader, somebody who was going too fast, much faster than he should have been going. He let his train get away from him and paid for it with his life.
And the railroad turned other men into legends. There was John Henry, for example. He was a steel-driving man. And what that meant was old John could spike down more railroad ties than any other man. But then along came the steam drill. John Henry challenged that machine and won. But the effort killed him, although this African-American lived on as a folk hero.
John Henry, when he was a baby, sitting down on his mammy's knee, picked up a hammer in his little right hand. That's gonna be the death of me. Hammer'll be the death of me.
But of course, the railroads were more than the sum of their stories. They would change the way you live every day in ways you probably never thought of. One example, what time is it? Before 1883, midday was whenever the sun was directly overhead. Simple enough, but that meant that when it was noon in downtown New York City, for example, it was just 11:58 in Philadelphia, 12:03 in Hartford, 11:59 in Newark, and 12:07 in Boston. Wisconsin had 38 local times, and Pittsburgh alone had 6. The first solution for railroads was to keep their own system-wide time, so you needed a bunch of clocks, one per railroad, in train stations where different lines met. This was nuts. Then the railroads came up with a much better solution. They created the broad time zones we know today. At one agreed-upon moment, noon on November 18, 1883, the nation's clocks were set in total agreement. By the way, there was strong opposition to this fiddling with what many considered God's time, and it wasn't until 1918 that Congress declared Standard Time the law. In the early part of our century, dramatic changes were occurring in the way the railroad transported people. Just as later roads would be replaced by limited access superhighways, local milk trains that stopped everywhere for water or fuel were replaced by sleek trains that made only big stops, the limiteds, whose names conjured up luxury and speed. And of course, two of the most famous luxury trains were the New York Central's 20th Century Limited, which raced between New York and Chicago. And its arch rival for the route, the Pennsylvania's Broadway Limited. In the 1930s, the Pennsylvania hired Raymond Loewy, one of America's greatest industrial designers, to completely modernize its locomotives, to pull the Broadway Limited's cars and make the train a showpiece of Art Deco design.
Then look, a herd of monsters is broken loose. Down the tracks they thunder, racing for joy, bellowing challenges to each other, roaring and boasting of their strength and speed, like the herds of wild, tough-skinned buffalo that used to roam the West.
When the diesel engine arrived in the 1930s, it started to push the steam engine off the tracks. The sights and sounds of a steam engine may quicken the pulse of a rail fan today, but back at the 1933 Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago, the gleaming new diesel seemed as much a visitor from the future as the first space shuttle 50 years later.
The old and the new in transportation are housed in the Travel and Transport Building. It is called the Building that Breathes. Outside the building, early steam locomotives are in sharp contrast to modern streamlined trains.
In one of the greatest substitutions, transformations in the history of American business, within 15 or 20 years, the entire railroad industry retired 30,000 steam locomotives and replaced them with 20,000 diesel-electric locomotives. The cost in billions of dollars was fantastic, but the efficiency was tremendous. Whereas at one locomotive terminal, to maintain a fleet of steam locomotives, it might take 100 or 200 men working around the clock. 20 men could maintain the equivalent horsepower in diesel locomotives.
Powered by electricity generated by diesel motors, these elegant all-stainless steel beauties were the future. No longer would trains have to stop regularly to replenish the engine's coal and water. The railroad started buying up the new engines as fast as the factories could turn them out, and soon the building of steam engines was no more.
In the late 1930s, the railroads re-equipped themselves, and they sought to compete against the private automobile, and the declining ridership brought on by the Great Depression, with what arguably are the great streamlined trains, trains like the Super Chief.
America's finest, most luxurious streamliner, the Super Chief.
All of these trains were deluxe or first-class trains, and everything from beauty salons and barbershops and onboard stewardesses, doctors and nurses. You could send telegrams, you could receive telephone calls. There was secretarial and clerical service, you could mail letters. These were the closest thing we've ever had to first-class rolling palaces on this continent. It was really the great era of passenger train travel in the United States.
Remember the last time you took a train trip? You probably took it all as a matter of course. Those convenient round-the-clock schedules. Those modern streamlined cars. Comfortable seats and easy riding. Wonderful food and excellent service. Soft, comfortable beds. In short, all of the comforts of home.
Of course, one reason for these comforts of home was that no matter how fast the train, you were still going to spend a good deal of time on it before you reached your destination. Think about it. Long after you could get on the phone and promise you'd rush cross-country from Chicago to Los Angeles for a meeting, you faced days getting there, so you wanted to be taken care of in the process.
It's Santa Fe all the way between Chicago and the West Coast. This is the train extraordinary. Extra fine, extra fare, extra comfort. Leaves Chicago and Los Angeles every evening and arrives 39 3/4 hours later.
And on the way to Los Angeles, trains like the Super Chief offered lounges with ever-changing views of America and dining rooms where you could get a thick, juicy steak or freshly caught Rocky Mountain trout. And when the conversation wore out, you could head off to sleep in your luxurious private bedroom. And where were these fancy diesels taking Americans?
A couple of weeks of golf in Florida is just what I need.
Florida became one of America's most popular destinations because of the railroad. At the turn of the century, you could visit Florida by rail, but you could go only as far as Palm Beach. But then, in 1912, the 82-year-old millionaire Henry Flagler completed the tracks of the Florida East Coast Railway nearly 100 miles south over new bridges and causeways to the remote Florida Keys.
Henry Flagler, as much as any other man, is responsibility, I think, for inventing the idea of Florida as a vacation paradise. Like many other railroads toward the end of the 19th century, the Florida East Coast Railroad began to market the idea that people could travel by rail for pleasure. And then as the railroad extended further and further down the coast, at the end of each new leg of the railroad, Flagler would build another hotel. So that at each leg of the journey, Flagler had another lure to dangle in front of passengers. Come to Palm Beach and stay at the Royal Poinciana. And to get to the Royal Poinciana, travel on the East Coast Railway.
Now, railroad tracks covered the entire East Coast from Maine to Florida. Highways would be built on the roadbeds of these earlier railroads. And when you drive to the Keys today, Flagler's East Coast Railway is part of what you're driving on. While some travelers took the train to go see things, other, more famous travelers took the train just to be seen.
As election time draws near, President Roosevelt speeds up his campaign with a whirlwind trip covering 5,000 miles and 11 states. Moving so fast that newsreels and newspapers had a hard time keeping up, Mr. Roosevelt set a re-election pace that encouraged new dealers in doubtful states.
Until the 1950s, the whistle-stop campaign was a mainstay of every politician's election season. At the open back of the old observation cars, the candidate would stand proud and visible as the train pulled into town to the welcoming oompah-pah of the local brass band. In 1948, President Harry Truman's Truman Special traveled 25,000 miles around the country and allowed 6 million Americans the chance to see the candidate up close. Truman was trailing badly in the polls in that race, and the press confidently assumed the Republican Thomas Dewey had the election locked. It's very probable that Truman's countless personal appearances aboard the special in these pre-television days are what brought him victory in November. It was a last-minute victory so unlikely that it led to one of the most famous photos in election history, taken aboard a train in St. Louis that election night in 1948. In the America of the 19th century, there was no time or money to spend on building train stations that were anything other than functional. You went to the station to get your ticket and get on the train, and if that wasn't enough for you, well, that was just too bad. Back in Europe, where they built the first working locomotives, train travel was more of an event. And train stations made that clear. They were opulent places that befitted a major event like a trip. But as train travel became more luxurious in a fast-growing America, the stations too began to take pride in their appearance and were built as permanent reminders of the power and wealth of the railroads. In 1875, the magazine Building News said, "Railway termini and hotels are to the 19th century what monasteries and cathedrals were to the 13th century." These days, very few people, if they're not scheduled to get on a plane or meet someone, go out to the airport just to hang out. But the big rail terminals were different. With their stores and restaurants, they were the centers of commercial activity. And in the heart of New York City, the rival Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroad lines built two of the most imposing buildings in town. In the old days, the Pennsylvania Railroad wasn't even able to enter Manhattan, since Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Central did its best to keep New York passenger traffic to itself. So the Pennsy had to unceremoniously dump its Manhattan-bound passengers in the swamps of New Jersey at a place called Manhattan Transfer. There they would continue their journey on a ferry boat to New York City. Then, in the 1890s, the Pennsy shrewdly took over the troubled Long Island Railroad and its greatest asset, legal access to New York City. With its foothold established, the Pennsylvania tunneled under the Hudson and built a huge and imposing "I'm the biggest damn business around" terminal, square in the heart of Midtown, named, not surprisingly, Pennsylvania Station. No modesty here. The legendary architectural firm of McKim, Mead, and White modeled it after the baths of the Emperor Caracalla in Rome. When it opened in 1910, it was the largest train station in the world. The main concourse was 71,000 square feet with a 150-foot ceiling. It could have held the entire U.S. Army of the time. Across town, old Commodore Vanderbilt had built a station way back in 1871, a great big greenhouse of a place that was always the center of giant horse-drawn traffic jams. The station was renovated in 1901, but it was still inadequate, since trains coming into the station had to enter a tunnel under Park Avenue that was constantly filled with choking coal smoke. The smoke got so bad that one passenger train slammed into the back of a freight and killed 17 people. That was it. There would be no more steam locomotives entering Manhattan. Electric engines became the law. With no need to ventilate locomotive smoke, the Central could now cover its tunnels and sell the land over them. It made a killing as Park Avenue was transformed from New York's filthiest boulevard to its most highly sought-after address for the rich and famous. And right in the middle of all this prime real estate, the New York Central constructed a new modern station to rival the Pence's across town. Grand Central Station was completed in 1913.
But these were the gateways to the city. These are how people symbolically entered these grand urban areas. The railroads were aware of the value of symbol and would erect these wonderful monuments to American ideals or to the railroad themselves. They were planting their imprint on the landscape. These stations were to be built for all time.
Pennsylvania Station may have been built to last forever, but it didn't. Its operators proved themselves to be the true descendants of the old robber barons when in 1963 they chose profit over heritage. They decreed that this great station should be torn down to make room for a new sports complex with a smaller train station beneath it. The destruction began before protesters had a chance to organize, and this architectural gem was soon demolished. Replaced by a new Madison Square Garden atop a new Penn Station that had all the charm of a shopping mall garage. By the way, the bitter rivalry between the Pennsylvania and the New York Central was long over by the time Penn Station was torn down. But at its height, no move by either railroad was too small to challenge. In their premier service between New York and Chicago, the Pennsylvania was first with its route across the mountains of Pennsylvania. The New York Central's route went up the east shore of the Hudson and west along the Old Erie Canal, and it made much of its water-level route easier to sleep on than the mountainous journey of the Pennsy. "Okay," said the Pennsy, "what do you think about this?" And it bought up land on the west shore of the Hudson and laid down track for a parallel route to Chicago. "Oh yeah," the Central replied, and it bought up land in Pennsylvania to build a parallel route to the Pensy's. At some point, both railroad owners realized this was crazy. The New York Central bought out the Pensy's West Shore line and ran passenger service along it for years. It's still used for freight traffic. As for the Central line in Pennsylvania, the railroad had only gotten as far as clearing the land, and if you've ever driven the Pennsylvania Turnpike, you've driven right over it. It became the roadbed for this very first superhighway in America. Grand Central Station in New York may be one of the few great terminals left, with 500,000 passengers passing through it daily. But there are others across the country, each reminiscent of an earlier time, each a survivor of countless attempts to replace it with something more practical. Union Station in Washington went through a number of costume changes before the government saw fit to restore it to its former glory. Across America, other stations have fought the wrecking ball successfully, and the surviving stations stand as a reminder of the glory days of train travel. But as magnificent as these downtown terminals may be, at the turn of the century, it's out of town where the railroads made their greatest impact. The railroad settled the West, and it also settled suburbia. In fact, these weary commuters played as much a part in railroad history as the robber barons and Jesse James. As early as the 1830s, railroads afforded their passengers the chance to work in the big city and live outside of it. Eventually, these daily passengers demanded that the railroads cut them a deal and give them a reduced fare for their regular patronage, and that changed, or commuted fare, gave its name to this whole new suburban way of life. Sometimes suburban towns would spring up along existing rail lines. One rich man might build a country house somewhere that would attract other rich men. When that happened, all the rich men would get together and pay for their own station in return for a promise of regular train service. And if you added a church and a bank next to the station, well, pretty soon you had a suburb.
When you could ride from a pleasant, green, semi-rural area 20 minutes to the heart of the city, it made no sense to continue living in a crowded urban environment. So that railroads very definitely gave us our modern notion of suburban living and, in a way, spoiled us.
Other times, the towns were first. Developers would plan whole new communities that would attract new rail lines and new homeowners from the city. By the 1950s, all those sleepy men reading the same newspapers, waiting for the same train every day, became something of a caricature. And as for the commute itself, well, ask any group of commuters and they'll tell you how deeply grateful they are to the railroad for giving them the pleasure that commuting has brought them.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun.
At the start of World War I, the railroad still had an image problem left over from the days of the robber barons. President Wilson thought the poorly run railroads too important to the war effort to be left to their own devices. So in 1917, he put them under the control of Uncle Sam. During World War I, America's trains transported millions of men and supplies to embarkation ports on the East Coast. When the war was over, the government returned the railroads to private ownership, hoping they would improve their arrogant ways. The period after World War I marked unprecedented advances for African Americans. Those working on the railroads had long been relegated to the lowest positions. As other railroad unions had gained steady strength, they remained totally closed to blacks. But there were some jobs given only to blacks, and the main one was the job of sleeping car porter. These men were at the beck and call of the mostly white passengers 24 hours a day. In 1925, these porters turned to A. Philip Randolph for help. Randolph organized the Brotherhood of Pullman Porters, and after a 12-year struggle, forced the Pullman Company to sign a union contract in 1937. This was the first labor contract ever made between a large American company and an African-American union. But then came the Depression, and it hit everyone hard. There were many who couldn't afford a ticket on a train. Today we rarely hear the term hobo anymore, or the word tramp, or even bum for that matter, and if we do, we assume they all mean pretty much the same thing. But a wanderer of the Depression era made this distinction. A hobo works and wanders. A tramp dreams and wanders. And a bum drinks and wanders. Of course, there were times in a man's life when he could be any of these. In an America where the work was often seasonal or temporary, manual and unprotected by a union, huge numbers of men were constantly on the move looking for that next job. once aboard a train, they knew all the places they could ride unseen. They'd be everywhere. On top of the boxcars, underneath the boxcars, in every nook and cranny. And the reason they hid were the railroad police hired to eject them. These bulls, as they were known, had a well-deserved reputation for violence and were the last people hobos wanted to see on their travels. To the survivors, the tales of narrow escapes, the camaraderie, all made for a life of great adventure. But the harsh reality of that life is another example of how the good old days were anything but. With the coming of World War II, the railroads were called on as never before, and they held this nation together. Forget the new airplanes, forget the automobile. Rationing of gas turned these into luxuries no one could afford. It was the train that would move men, women, and goods to war in numbers never dreamed of, transporting 90% of the freight and 97% of the armed forces across America. All at once, the railroads were at the center of things, carrying all the warriors and all the instruments of war off to their embarkation ports. It was impossible to be unaware of what the railroads were doing. It was a mammoth task that the railroads pulled off magnificently by putting every one of their employees and every rusted-out old engine or car they could put their hands on to work. And all that work not only helped win the war, it also made the railroads very rich. It was a poorly run railroad indeed that wasn't making it big during the war. Even the old Erie, maybe the worst run railroad in American history, was paying dividends for the first time in nearly 70 years. By the war's end, the railroads were once again on top of their form.
Only a few years ago, there were those who said the railroads were through. Well, today, they are literally the lifeline of America.
The post-war period promised to be a golden age for the railroads. How could it not be? The Depression was over. Returning troops were growing families aplenty, and those families were moving all over the country into new houses built with materials that also had to be shipped around. America's economy and birth rate were in the midst of an unprecedented boom. Who would have dreamed that America's mighty railroad industry was about to bust? It has been said that the downfall of America's railroads was due to the fact that the railroads thought they were in the train business and not the transportation business. Such arrogance gave the public an opportunity to seize on ways to travel without getting on a train. So when the internal combustion engine became practical, it appealed to Americans like food to a starving man. At first, with typical overconfidence, the railroads didn't see the car as much of a threat. After all, cars were expensive and good roads were scarce. But after World War II, America was car crazy. Prices came down and highways went up. The American dream of the 1950s wasn't a family, a house with a picket fence, a big dog, and a locomotive. It was a car that would move the family around, preferably a big, new, shiny one. Even better, 2 of them to fill up the new garage.
America has a thing for cars, unlike anywhere else in the world that I know of. If it's on rubber, people love it.
There's no way that you can compare the flexibility of getting out of your house and getting into a car and driving anywhere you wanted with having to get to a railway station one way or another and then travel somewhere. So the fascination with the automobile by the American public, which started, I would say, in earnest right after World War II, I think led to an inevitable decline in rail travel.
And before the 50s were out, the airplane would capture our imagination. And why not? Here was a real piece of the future, something that could make us mobile like we'd never dreamed. The trains? Well, that was old stuff. They'd been here forever. Nothing to get nostalgic about. They were still around if you wanted to take them. With cars killing off their passenger business after the war, the railroads turned their emphasis to the freight business in order to survive. The big railroad lines learned to move freight cheaper and faster than trucks and to work in conjunction with them.
Rail services and those of the trucking lines can be combined. Each contributes its own advantages to the moving of goods, complementing, not substituting, for each other.
Then in the 1950s and 60s, merger frenzy and the decline in the number of passengers turned a phone book of old railroad names into a 3x5 card of new ones. It's as if the old robber barons had returned and were buying up every railroad in sight. But now the owners were multinational corporations with all the personality of accounting firms. Today, computers help guide huge 200-car freight trains across America. So then what happened to the passengers when freight took over the rails? Well, they got something of a reprieve from near certain extinction when Uncle Sam took over long-distance passenger service in 1970 with the creation of Amtrak.
By the mid-1960s, the American intercity passenger railroad system had become a national scandal. The railroads were required, mandated by federal law, to continue to operate passenger trains even on unpopular and unprofitable lines. Amtrak came into existence in 1971 to rescue the skeleton of the once extensive intercity railroad passenger system and has managed to resuscitate the railroad passenger train in a modern form.
Amtrak's newest equipment, like its Viewliners, are as modern as any aircraft, but are still a throwback to the days when it was the passenger the trains were built for. So what's ahead? Way back in the 19th century, the government may have poured money into getting passengers across the country, but today, Amtrak is in danger of losing its limited federal backing at any moment. Does passenger service have a future here? There are plans to introduce high-speed trains like those in France and Japan. But in America, the priority has been to subsidize highways and air travel and not the railways. While other nations pay for their advanced systems with revenues from gasoline taxes, it seems unlikely America will ever make the kind of investment needed for such an enormous modernization project.
I find it ironic today that the Europeans are envious of our freight network, wish they had one as efficient and as effective. We, on the other hand, are envious of the Europeans' passenger network. Well, these are basically just social policy choices. We have chosen to emphasize the automobile and the airplane. They have chosen to emphasize instead the passenger railroad.
As long as America's love affair with the car continues, high-speed train travel in this country will always be just a wish. One advantage train travel still holds over other forms of transportation is that it has always provided the best way of seeing America's scenic wonders.
It's really great fun traveling on trains. You can sit for hours just watching the scenery as it rushes by. It's almost like a travel motion picture, one of the most interesting motion pictures you could possibly imagine.
Today, scenic rail lines, such as the Grand Canyon Railroad in Williams, Arizona, which takes hundreds of people a day to the edge of the canyon, offer millions of Americans a way to experience their nation's natural beauty without clogging our roads with all those cars. And if you want to make the entire USA your excursion and you have a spare $5,000, you can take the American Orient Express from coast to coast. We're going to cross America from Washington to Los Angeles and take 50 years off the calendar to recapture the romance and luxury that traveling by rail used to be all about.
Traveling on the American Orient Express is an experience. It's not a means of transportation. For people who want to go from one coast to the other coast, you could certainly do it very quickly and very cheaply on a number of different airlines. It's for people who want to slow down. It's for people who want to be away from telephones and televisions. We're trying to recreate sort of the comfortable and luxurious pace of travel that used to occur 50 years ago.
While traveling by car may be faster, the American Orient Express can take you places cars never go. Whether you're eating breakfast in the dining car or reading the newspaper in the lounge, you can look out on an America that time forgot. Some of these routes were laid down over 100 years ago through remote locations not reachable by any highway.
Hi there.
And why aren't there more trains like the American Orient Express? Well, because the operation is a massive undertaking in an American railroad world that has forsaken the passenger business. It's not easy staffing such a train. There just aren't as many great chefs who can cook in a moving kitchen as there used to be. Good porters are also hard to find. But the American Orient Express has one for every sleeping car.
5 o'clock I wake up, 6 o'clock I'm on duty, and I work till around about 10:30. I'll eat breakfast, and then come back to the car, make sure everybody's okay, get them ready for lunch. And then if I have a little time in between, if they get off the train for a tour, I'll usually have a couple hours where I can get some shut-eye. Back on the job by 5. Usually I'm in my room by 11, and if I'm lucky, I can sleep till like 5 o'clock again in the morning.
And we've got 2 baby grand pianos on the train. One's here in the Seattle car, and there's a seating for about 24 or 25 people here in sort of a living room type comfort.
Traveling by train is rarely this much of a pleasure anymore. In fact, in America, each year that goes by, we see fewer passenger trains of any kind carrying fewer passengers. It's been nearly 200 years since the railroad first came to America, and nearly 150 since the dream of an America tied by rail captured our imagination. And during most of that time, it all really worked. We look back now at the great days of the great trains and wonder how we could have lost something so central to our lives, something so clever and so delightful, and so American.
Railroads, I think, give us a sense of comfort. They let us know we're connected, that there is someone else out there. And I think as a people, they let us know that we have an out. We have a means of escape. And I think the idea that anyone could go down to the station and for a couple of bucks buy a ticket out of town has been a powerful force in our culture. I think railroads, too, are like dinosaurs. They're huge and massive, they make noise, they're colorful, they move through the landscape, and they're impressive, maybe even a little bit frightening, and we like that sort of thing.
But the memory of what trains were lives on in our collective souls in countless ways, and it is still as powerful as the greatest of the old locomotives. That memory is in our language when we get sidetracked or need to blow off some steam. That memory still lives in a circus train that keeps us all the age of our kids. That memory is kept alive by engineers who drive their trains not overland, but underground, in basements from coast to coast. That memory lives in the millions who shudder to the thunder of steam on summer excursions. The fact is, the railroad will always be a part of America's wanderlust, and it will always be not a way of getting there, but a way of going. And when the train itself has passed, its sound will remain in our memory forever.